Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to our participants from North America. I'm pleased to open our symposium organized by the Goldstein-Goren Diaspora Research Center, titled Patriotism, Combat, and Jewish Identity, the Experience of Jewish Soldiers in the Two World Wars. And allow me, please, to say a few words as an introduction to this symposium. Soon after the outbreak of the First World War, and particularly towards the end of the war and its afterward, anti-Semitic activists, especially in the defeated countries of Central Europe, Germany, and Hungary, blamed the Jews for shrinking their military duty and especially avoiding a frontline combat service. This accusation played an essential role in the anti-Jewish campaign in the interwar period. A leading argument was that only who is ready to shed his blood for his motherland is eligible for civil rights in his country. It went hand with the classic anti-Semitic stereotype about the allegedly disloyalty of the Jews to their homeland and the allegedly Jewish cowardice. This stereotype about the Jewish cowardice and the fear of fighting from the time of immemorial in the diaspora became also fixed in the Hebrew culture and the Zionist ideology at the end of the 19th century, and then struck roots in the public discourse in the Jewish community in Palestine. It affected considerably the debate in Israel about the Jewish response during the Holocaust and the common idea about the Jews who went allegedly to the slaughter without resistance. In recent years, the Goldstein-Goren Diaspora Research Center has conducted a research project on the Jewish soldiers during World War II, supported by the Claims Conference. And I would like to take this opportunity and to thank the Claims Conference for their generous support. A collection of articles about Jewish soldiers in World War II is forthcoming. Over the last year, the center organized a series of lectures in Hebrew, open to the public, on Jewish soldiers in the Allies' armies and of members of resistant groups. Millions of Jews fought as loyal patriots of their countries, and particularly during the World War II, as Jews against the German oppressors and their collaborators. It contradicts the anti-Semitic allegations and the stereotype about the Jewish cowardice and the fear of fighting in the diaspora. I would like to thank Professor Simha Goldin, the previous head of our center, who initiated the project about the Jewish soldiers, and the three leading researchers of this project, Dr. François Uzan, Dr. Galit Haddad, and Dr. Leonid Smilovitsky, and as usual, to thank my colleagues, Sarah Appel and Adi Boskovich, who organized this conference. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very successful symposium. Simha?
Thank you, honored friends and colleagues. I am delighted to open this significant event organized by the Goldstein-Goren Diaspora Research Center as a part of its research project, Jewish Soldiers in World War II. Since this project's establishment, the center has held a number of conferences, as Roni said, and research workshops on the topic, and it is currently preparing to publish a volume of important articles on this topic. This will be one of the very first books in Hebrew to explore these subjects. It's very important. Over the course of the last several years, we established also the Tzanchane Shuv project, which included reconstruction of the journey of the young paratroopers who parachuted into Slovenia, passed through Croatia, and on to Budapest in Hungary. The project focused on the figure of Hannah Senesh, and one of the outcomes of the project was a trip by the IDF paratroopers in July 2021, which followed the path of the Tzanchane Shuv. I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate two of the research which are here, Dr. Simha Audoin and Dr. Galit Haddad, who organized this symposium, on their involvement in the project, on their valuable research on the subject, and particularly for their initiative and work in preparing this event. Thank you, and all welcome.
Thank you all for joining us today for this meeting. My name is Galit Haddad, and I'm happy to welcome you to this first afternoon's panel. And many thanks to both the guests for accepting to participate in this event and to honor us with your presence. The first session will focus on the experience of Jewish soldiers in both the French and American armies during the First World War. Two conferences that addresses the question of mobilization, combat, patriotism, and especially the complex relationship between national identity and Jewish identity arise in this context of the war. The first lecture will be given by Stéphane Audoin-Rouzeau on the experience of French Jewish combatants concerning especially on Jewish social scientists and intellectuals who were enlisted in 1914. And the second lecture by Marcel Neiberg, he will talk about the mobilization and war experience of Jewish soldiers who served in the American forces. The panel will be run as follows. We will have two conferences, each conference 30 minutes, for each paper, and after both presentation, we will take time for a discussion. So we start with Stéphane Audoin-Rouzeau paper on the war, on the experience of war of Marc Bloch, Marcel Mauss, and Robert Hertz, three social scientists in 1918. Stéphane is Director of Studies at the School of Advanced Studies in Social Science in Paris. He is the President of the International Research Center of the Historiale de la Grande Guerre in Péronne. His primary area of expertise is the Great War history, but from a cultural historical perspective. His earlier research focused on the experience of French combatants as well as on the issue of intimate war grief, topics that we had the opportunity to hear about at Tel Aviv University on several occasions. And in particular, he published with Annette Becker, 14-18, Retrouver la guerre. It was translated to English under the title Understanding the Great War. Les armes et la chair, Three Objects of Death in 1914. It's my translation, sorry. Weapons and Flesh, Three Objects of Death. His interest also led him to consider contemporary war violence from anthropology perspective, mainly war violence in contemporary conflicts. He published Combattre, une anthropologie historique de la guerre moderne, Combat, Historical Anthropology of Modern Warfare. And in 2013, he published a more personal essay, Quelle histoire? Un récit de filiation, a history of filiation. This book, it's about how the Great War affected 3 generations of his family. And his most recent book on the First World War, which is a collection of articles, was published a year ago. It's Wartime, Small Subject on the Phenomenon of War Violence, published last year. And finally, his works has also led him since 2008 to address the issue of the Tutsi genocide in Rwanda. And based on his fieldwork in Rwanda, he has published Une initiation Rwanda. I hope that I translated all your books' titles correctly, Stéphane. And please, Stéphane, you may begin.
Okay, thank you, Galit, for this kind presentation. And thank you, first of all, to the Goldstein-Goren Diaspora Research Center at Tel Aviv University for its kind invitation to participate in this symposium on the experience of Jewish soldiers in the 2 world wars. So before 1914, the Jewish community in France and Algeria, smaller than in Germany or in the United Kingdom, was known to number approximately 180,000. And among them, 30,000 Jews came from Central Europe and the Ottoman Empire. The Israelite of France, that is how they call themselves and define themselves, relied massively to the war in which France found itself engaged from August 1914 onwards. And the historiography has shown that this rallying was unwavering, and we will return to the reason for this later in this paper. If we concentrate on the men mobilized in the armed forces, we can consider that 16,000 Jews were put under uniform between 1914 and 1918 in France. And because of the level of education of many French Jews, thanks to the Third Republic in particular, many held positions of responsibility as non-commissioned officers and junior officers. But it should be noted that at the same time, that French professional army included several Jewish senior officers and even generals. It is from this world of officers from the Jewish intellectual bourgeoisie that Marcel Mauss, Robert Hertz, and Marc Bloch belong, and I would like to focus on them in this paper. All 3 have in common that they belong to the social sciences. And it is in this capacity that they have long interested me, in particular for all that they did not say about their experience of the Great War, but it's not my subject for today. All 3 came from the famous École Normale Supérieure of the Rue d'Ulm in Paris, Mauss and Hertz having a philosophical background, Marc Bloch, as is well known, an historical one. Marcel Mauss, who was Émile Durkheim's nephew, Marcel Mauss was the oldest, 42 years old in 1914. Robert Hertz, born in 1881, was 33 at the beginning of the war. Marc Bloch was younger, he was only 28 in 1914. For these reasons of age in particular, the degree of commitment to an academic career was not the same. Marc Bloch had begun a thesis on serfdom in the Middle Ages in the Île-de-France, but he was still a secondary school teacher in the summer of 1914. Mauss, on the other hand, had been teaching at the École pratique des hautes études since 1901 and had been assisting his uncle, Émile Durkheim, at l'année sociologique since 1898. Robert Hertz, although younger, had also begun a brilliant academic career before the war, From 1905-1906, he had been collaborating with l'Année sociologique and had also entered the École pratique des hautes études. All three were drafted into the infantry at the beginning of the war, but their destinies were different. Mauss enlisted voluntarily on September 1914. Appointed interpreter, he was first assigned to a British division, then to an Australian division from June 1916. Initially a corporal, he became an officer in July 1915. He went through several important battles of the Great War, which earned him several French and British decorations before being demobilized in 1919, at the age of 47. The mourning of his friends who died in the war, and the mourning, especially the mourning of his uncle Emile Durkheim, who died in 1917, manifested itself throughout the interwar period with particular force. Marc Bloch was mobilized as an infantry sergeant in 1914, and it was with this rank that he fought during the first month of the war, which were also the most deadly. He became an officer in March 1916 and even reached the rank of captain in August 1918. 1 year before, in August 1917, he became an intelligence officer and was part of the regimental staff. He ended the war with the Croix de Guerre and the Legion of Honor. Neither Marcel Mauss nor Marc Bloch were wounded during the war, but Robert Hertz did not live to see the end of this war. He was also a sergeant at the beginning of the conflict and became a second lieutenant on April 1915, April the 3rd, 1915, before dying in the Verdun sector 10 days later on April the 13th. To try to approach the war experience of these three men, we unfortunately do not have the same types of sources. Concerning the documents written during the conflict itself, in the case of Marcel Mauss, we only have his letters to his friend Etienne Hubert, and not the letters sent, unfortunately, not the letters sent to his uncle, Emile Durkheim, but we can nevertheless perceive the reverberation of Mauss's letters in those that Durkheim addressed to his nephew. After the war, Mauss would only return to his war experience in a scattered manner, in particular in an in memoriam published in l'Année sociologique in 1925, and especially in a conference given in 1934 named Les Techniques du Corps and published in the Journal of Psychology in March-April 1936. Marc Bloch's war texts are also few in number, unfortunately. Two last letters written to his parents in 1915 and in 1917, a notebook intended above all to help him find his bearings in time and space, and then an unfinished text written while convalescing in the spring of 1915 after a bout of typhoid, Souvenirs de guerre, Memories of War, 1914-1915, a short text, a great text, but a short text, briefly taken up again in 1917, but before being abandoned by the author. Like Mauss, Marc Bloch did not return to the Great War after 1918, with the exception of his great article, Reflections of an Historian on the False News of the War, published in the Revue de Synthèse in 1921, and with another exception, of course, L'étrange défaite, written in a completely different context, a completely different context, that of the immediate aftermath of the French defeat of May-June 1940. In the case of Robert Hertz, on the other hand, we are fortunate to have a rich wartime correspondence composed of letters sent to his wife, Alice, between August 1914 and April 1915, the year of his death. A correspondence described by the historian Jean-Jacques Becker as I quote from him, as an incredible intellectual discovery when it was published in 2002. And I will refer to it extensively in the second part of this paper. These three social scientists engaged in the war as combatants are very symptomatic of the strength of the commitment of Israelitism to the service of France at war between 1914 and 1918, even if, as we will see, Robert Hertz clearly stands out. All three manifested an unconditional support for French Republican values, a support stemming from the emancipation of the Jews of France during the French Revolution, confirmed in their eyes by the establishment of the Third Republic. All three are characteristic of what has been called French Israelitism at its peak before 1914, a symbiosis between the Republic and the ideals of the Jewish tradition, a symbiosis that was only reinforced by the victory of Dreyfusism and the rehabilitation of Dreyfus himself in 1906. The role played by the 2,000 Jews from Alsace-Lorraine who had chosen France after 1871, including Marc Bloch's family, only strengthened this powerful patriotism of French Israelitism by giving it, moreover, an anti-German coloring, which was, of course, exacerbated in 1914 and 1818. With Mauss, Bloch, and Hertz, we are thus in presence of a perfect representatives of a communal patriotism, fully participating in the sacred union. A sacred union made easier by the fact that nationalist anti-Semitism before 1914 was muted. Marcel Mauss, despite his age, volunteered at the beginning of September 1914. His patriotism was very clear. The Germans were the Krauts, les Boches in French, and they had to be defeated. At the beginning of 1915, he believed that victory was near and continued to believe in it year after year. Except for the end of 1917, there is no trace of any doubt in his letters to Etienne Hubert, despite the progression of the war. In April 1918, at the height of the German offensives, he said he was, I quote from him, he says he was happy to be at the front and in the battle, or rather near the battle, end of quote. And on August 1918, the same year, he says, I do not regret having been in the battle, end of quote. Robert Hertz, for his part, belonged to the Territorial Army. From the end of October 1914, feeling too little exposed, he volunteered to go into the reserve of the active army in a very conscious search for danger. For all three, going to war was an honor. Very characteristic here is the first line of Marc Bloch's war memories. I quote from him, I had the honor of taking part in the first 5 months of 1914-1915 campaign, end of quote. Likewise, in his last letter of late November 1917, written after more than 3 years of war, I quote, even as I write this letter, I firmly hope that it will never be sent, but I am all ready for the sacrifice, and I accept it, I dare say, without shudder, but not without pride, end of quote. None of them complained of any anti-Semitism at the front. According to his son, Etienne Bloch, however, Marc Bloch wondered whether his modest promotion from sergeant to adjutant on November 1914, before he finally became an officer in March 1916, had been a manifestation of anti-Semitic reluctance on the part of his captain. But it was a suspicion expressed after the fact, even after the war, not a certainty. More broadly, in the case of Mauss and Bloch, nothing characterizes them as Jews in their wartime writings. Their Jewishness doesn't seem to occupy a place in the question of their personal role during the war. French patriotism takes precedence over any sense of Jewish belonging. In the case of Mauss, this is consistent with the attitude of his uncle, Émile Durkheim, who, despite his rabbi father, largely crumpled his ties to Judaism. In the obituaries he wrote on Robert Hertz and on his own son for the annuaire de l'Association des anciens élèves de l'ENS, he did not say a word about the Jewishness of either of them. Similarly, while Durkheim presided in 1916 over a commission des étrangers, a foreigners commission, which was particularly concerned with the examination of the military situation of Russian residents of the Seine department, and while the latter was the object of a press campaign against immigrant Jews, Durkheim placed himself at a good distance from the latter. Thus, on February 1916, he writes to his nephew, "I've never been so enjuivé." I'm sorry, I don't know how to translate this word enjuivé in English. "I've never been so enjuivé. If this continues, I will become the advisor and tutor of exotic Judaism. It must be recognized that there are great miseries of all kinds. Just now, I received a letter from an unfortunate Russian Jew who seems to be persecuted by the police and whose existence will be sabotaged. What misery," end of quote. And when, as a Jew, in April 1916, Durkheim was attacked in the Senate by a nationalist as, I quote, a representative of the German Kriegsministerium, he wrote to the senator who had insulted him. I quote from him, "Of course, I felt in no way affected by this absurd insult. I am above it. The only feeling I had when I read the words you spoke from the rostrum was a real sadness that a senator was not afraid to make such an odious accusation against one of his countrymen," end of quote. And about the death of his son, which had occurred a short time before, he added, "I do not want his blood to serve me as some abominable redemption," end of quote. In essence, Durkheim is not so far removed from what the Jewish combatant Marc Boasson proposed. I quote from him, "I believe that even after the war, even after having paid the blood tax, the French Jew has a great duty to fulfill. He must deliberately break with his Jewish past," end of quote. The case of Robert Hertz is quite distinct from that of Bloch and Mauss. In his case, a willingness to sacrifice as a means of definitive integration through the shedding of blood is obvious. The historian Philippe Landau speaks in this respect, I quote from him, of an unconditional desire to seal their adhesion to the country with blood. He speaks of an unconscious desire to fall on the field of honor as a means of recognition by the other, by the rest of the French community, of course. However, Robert Hertz never complained about any anti-Semitism in the army. On the contrary, he felt that he was integrated into the combatant environment. I quote, "It's a blessing to live among them, especially for Jews," he said. He wrote this sentence in March 1915, 1 month before his death at the front. Once he became an officer, he noted on April 1915, I was welcomed in the most charming way by the officers of the battalion, and I feel well honored and happy to be now their comrade, end of quote. But Hertz's father was of foreign origin, German, to be exact. And his son develops a literally sacrificial conception of his role as a French soldier. Here is how he presents to his wife his decision to volunteer for the active reserve on October 1914. I quote, "What a pleasure to resume the real life on the infantryman, marching on the roads day or night in silence, especially when we go forward towards the enemy, towards danger. I hope we will see and do beautiful things, that we will go forward as far as possible," end of quote. Alice Hertz, his wife, revolts against such a decision. On November 1914, he replies to her in these terms, I quote, "Dear, as a Jew, I feel the time has come to give a little more than my due, because there are many who have given or who give much less than they have received. There will never be enough Jewish devotion in this war, never too much Jewish blood spilled on French soil. If I can provide my son with good and true reasons for great naturalization, it seems to me that it is the best gift I can give him," end of quote. Hertz sometimes finds literal Parisian accents to rejoice in the fertilizing aspect of the war for France. I quote once more, "I firmly believe that this war, if it does not inaugurate the millennium, will have all the same profoundly renewed and for the better Europe and France." Hertz writes this sentence in November 1914. The most astonishing thing perhaps, is that this attraction of sacrifice in Hertz resists the prolongation of the war, and in particular the first winter of war spent in the terrible area of Verdun. In one of his last letters, written on April 1915, he again makes explicit the sacrificial impulse felt since his own childhood. I quote from him, "With all my being, I wanted to be French, to deserve to be French, to prove that I was French. Now, the old childish dream lives again in me, more ardent than ever. I'm grateful to the chiefs who accept me as their subordinate, to the men whom I'm proud to command, they, the children of a truly chosen people. Yes, dear, I'm filled with gratitude to the fatherland that accepts me and fulfills me. Nothing will be too much to pay for it. And may my little boy always walk with his head held high, and in the restored France, not now the torment that poisoned many hours of our childhood and youth. Am I French? Do I deserve to be? I see this war as a welcome opportunity to regularize the situation for us and for our children," end of quote. And just before the attack of April the 13th, when he was to be killed, he wrote again, "Your valor, yours, my dear wife, helps me to walk with a cheerful and grateful heart towards a harsh and beneficial trial. At last, after 8 months, wish me to behave like a man and to be worthy of you and of all of you," end of quote. Émile Durkheim, who was torn by the news of Hertz's death, was stunned, on the other hand, when Alice showed him her husband's letters. He then wrote to Mauss the following lines: "The poor boy had gone away with a somewhat fixed idea that he would not come back. She read me letters of exaggerated detachment. One can do one's duty, all one's duty, and not offer oneself to fate in advance. He wanted to redeem the faults of Israel in the true sense of the word. End of quote. And while writing the obituary of Hertz, he wrote to Marcel Mauss, he was definitely a very noble soul, but his idealism was a bit frivolous. There are in his letters to his wife many passages of high inspiration, but under which it's impossible for me to put anything precise. End of quote. In conclusion, Annette Becker and I have suggested the term consent to characterize the attitude of the French towards the war between 1914 and 1918. And Jewish combatant intellectuals perfectly express this consent, of which some, like Hertz, present a particularly radical version. As Annette Becker has written, they do everything to prove to themselves, and especially to others, that they have definitely achieved civic and personal integration, that they are French and Jewish. End of quote. At the same time, we can better measure the extent of the disillusionment of the Jews of France during the interwar period and the Second World War. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Stéphane, for this fascinating lecture that brought a different angle to our question of the identity of the Jewish combatant in the First World War. And I'm sure that many of us will have questions. I suggest that now we will pass to the next lecture. We shall now move to Michael Neiberg lecture on the American Jewish soldiers. Michael Neiberg is a professor of history and chair of war studies at the United States Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where he teaches history, strategy, and regional studies. He has published widely on the First and the Second World War from a global perspective, including on the experience of America and France. The Harry Truman Prize was awarded to him to his book Potsdam, The End of World War II and the Remaking of Europe, basic books in 2015. The Wall Street Journal named his Dance of Furies, Europe and the Outbreak of the World War I, published in Harvard University Press in 2011, one of the 5 best books ever written about that war. In 2017, he was awarded the Goldin Medal of the French Renaissance, an organization created by French President Raymond Poincaré in 1915 to preserve French culture during World War I. And his most recent book, When France Fell, The Vichy Crisis and the Fate of the Anglo-American Relationship, published in Harvard University Press last year. And this book is the winner of the Society of Military History Distinguished Book Award for 1992. So, Michael, you can start.
Thank you very much. Merci Galit, Toda Rabba to Adi for all of her help as well in getting this all set up. It's a pleasure to be here. I wish I was with you in Tel Aviv, but this will have to do. It's also a pleasure to be on a panel with Stéphane. Some themes in my talk will be similar to some of the themes that we heard in his talk, with perhaps one exception. What I want to do in this talk is start by talking about some of the themes that set the context for American Jewish participation in World War I. And then in the second half, I want to bring the words of some American Jewish soldiers to explain what they thought they were doing by fighting in this war. And here's where I think we'll see some similarities in some of the themes Stéphane just spoke about. To set this context, what's important to me, what I think is really relevant here, is to understand two things about the context. The first is that the mass migration of Jews, most of them Ashkenazi Jews, to the United States occurred in the few decades prior to the First World War, from the 1890s to about 1914 or 1915. What that means is there are most American Jews are either born in Europe or the children of people born in Europe. And I'll talk about that here because that's very important. Second, to me, what's very important is that when the First World War began in 1914 in Europe, the American Jewish population was in fact out of step with where the American views on the war were more generally. When the First World War began, the vast majority of Americans sympathized with Britain and France, were instinctively anti-German, although they did not want to be involved in the war. They wanted to maintain American neutrality. The American Jewish community was somewhat different, and you can see the attitudes here reflected in the Yiddish Tageblatt of New York City. To the Jews of the United States, the vast majority of Jews in the United States, the initial response to the First World War is to be anti-Russian, which means an inclination to be pro-German and pro-Austrian, or to argue for an absolutely strict neutrality, that it doesn't involve America in any way. The French connection here comes both with the memories of the very recent Dreyfus affair and the anti-Semitism in France stirred up during the Dreyfus affair, and by extension, the problem that many American Jews had with the fact that Republican France had formed an alliance with not just the autocratic regime of the Tsar, but the intensely anti-Semitic regime of the Tsar. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that at the outbreak of World War I, the Jewish American opinion on the war is different from that of mainstream America. And what I'd like to show in the next few minutes here is how that changes, how American Jewish opinions of World War I come to align themselves with those of the United States more generally, and how important that process of alignment is. By contrast, many Jewish Americans saw Germany and especially Austria-Hungary as being relatively benign, relatively good places for Jews, especially in contrast to Russia. So to American Jews, it's very difficult to imagine a war in which Russia wins as being something that is good both for Europe and is good for Jews more generally. Here's what begins to change that, and this is what I want to talk about for the next couple of minutes in setting the context. The first is the behavior of the German army, and to a lesser extent, the Austro-Hungarian army, as the German army begins to move east. And the map that you see here on the right is a reference to the 1915 Gorlice-Tarnow offensive, which moves the line significantly, as you can see, from what we would today, I suppose, call Western Poland, just west of Warsaw, all the way through Galicia into what we would today call Ukraine and Belarus, a major shift. Inside that space that is created as the German army moves east, the German army begins to take action against the locals, including Jews. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. It's been a topic of tremendous historical debate as to whether this German action in World War I begins to preview what the Germans will do in the Second World War, or whether these are two separate historical phenomena. But there's no doubt that as the German army and Austro-Hungarian armies begin to move east, two things happen. One is that the German army and Austro-Hungarian armies inflict great suffering upon the Jews living in these places. The second is that rural Jews especially leave this area and move to cities, especially to Vienna, which creates an anti-Semitic backlash in both Germany and inside Austria-Hungary. So the first factor in changing American Jewish opinion is German behavior in Poland, which seems to suggest that for Jews, life under German or Austro-Hungarian rule may not be marginally anything more than marginally better than life under the Tsar. The second factor that I want to talk about are the changing attitudes of the British and the French, especially with regards to Zionism, and of course the Balfour Declaration, which I'll talk about in just a bit. And the third, and to me the most important of the factors, is the end of the Tsar's regime in Russia. And I want to talk about that a bit as we move forward too. First, as the German and Austro-Hungarian armies move eastward, the expectation among many Jews in the United States is that this will produce a far greater level of life, of comfort, of way of living for Jews living in the Pale of Settlement, that area of the western part of the Russian Empire. In fact, this does not turn out to be the case, as you can see from this demonstration here on the right. And you can see it begins from the very moments that the war begins. It begins actually in September 1914, where Vorwärts, a Jewish socialist newspaper in New York City, talks about German soldiers coming through Poland, looting, plundering, destroying cities, destroying communities. The point is that this begins to create a disillusion in the United States. I would argue it's happening in London. It's probably happening among French Jewish community as well, although Stéphane would be better poised to talk about that than I would, in which people start to conclude, again, that life under German occupation might not be any better than life had been under Russian occupation. The second factor that I want to talk about is the shifting ideas of the British and of the French. We all know this document, the Balfour Declaration of November 2nd, 1917, but I want to highlight a couple of things about it. The first is the date, which is going to come, of course, at the moment of the Soviet Revolution and the final end of Tsarism as well. For Jews, American Jews, once the British make this declaration in favor of Zionism, it now becomes much easier for American Jews who still had not fully made up their minds to become pro-Allied. Now, an Allied victory, an Allied success in the war means the possibility of establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So what you have is a shift in the American Jewish opinion towards thinking about this war now, not only in terms of their American identity, but also in terms of what this means for their Jewish identity. And of course, French support for the Balfour Declaration, French support for the concept of Zionism in general also helps to shift American views. And again, the point that I want to underscore, the 2 points I really want to underscore and highlight again, are the ways in which American Jewish views are coming into alignment with those of Americans more generally, non-Jewish Americans. And second, the way that this process is gelling right about the time of America's entry into the war and of the end of the Tsarist Empire. And that's what I want to focus on here. This image that I'm going to show you comes from the diary of Rabbi Samuel Price, based in Massachusetts. And on the day of the Tsar's capitulation in March 1917 in the Western calendar, these are the words that he wrote in his diary: "Freedom for Jews," that the end of the Tsar, the end of this terribly oppressive anti-Semitic regime was a very important date in Jewish history. And again, I want to focus on this because this is March 1917, just before American entry into the First World War. So for American Jews, what this means is the goals of the United States in entering World War I and the goals of the Jewish community in entering World War I are now in nearly perfect alignment at exactly the right moment. And Rabbi Price was so overwhelmed by the abdication of the Tsar and what it might mean for the Jewish people, that he proposed adding March 17th as another one of the high holidays. It meant that much, to put it on the Jewish calendar alongside Yom Kippur, alongside Rosh Hashanah, alongside all of the other Purim, all Passover, all of the other holidays. It meant that much. And again, this is happening just as the United States is abandoning neutrality to enter belligerence. So you see here from Vorwärts again, a victory for present-day Germany would be a threat to the Russian Revolution and dangerous for democracy in Europe. Again, what we're talking about here is the first Russian Revolution, not the Bolshevik one, the complications of which will come later. This, to me, is the single most important factor in finally, definitively, absolutely changing the views of any American Jews who were still not sure what they wanted out of the war or still not quite yet on the side of the Allies. Now there's no question in the eyes of most American Jews that the strategic aims of the Allied powers, including now the United States, and the strategic aims of the Jewish people are now in perfect alignment. That's very important. That's a major shift from 1914 to 1917. So in the second half of this, I want to talk about what I've been able to find about these Jewish soldiers and about what we know about them. We don't know a lot, unfortunately. There isn't a lot of documentary evidence. Where I work here in Carlisle, we have the U.S. Army's archive, and there just isn't a whole lot. The United States Army did not identify Jews as such, so it's a little difficult to parse out information. From the database that I was able to identify, 67 or 54 of the 67 soldiers whose birthplace I can identify were born in Europe that joined the American Army. Admittedly, this is a poor sample size. I admit that. Most of them born in either Russian Poland or born in Russia itself. And what we see when we look at the words that they left behind, and most of these come from the American Jewish Archive in Cincinnati, what you see is this notion of the First World War coming together, bringing an opportunity for American Jews to assimilate and to serve both as Jews and as Americans. Again, very similar to what Stéphane was talking about with the French. And you can see that here in a letter that Israel Beton wrote to the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, at this moment, April 1917, when the United States had finally and definitively decided to end neutrality and move into belligerence. And you can see the way that he's talking about these things coming together. And the reason I think this is important, and I spent quite a bit of time in the book I wrote on this topic, historians have generally seen this in the United States as a top-down process. In other words, historians have generally argued that Woodrow Wilson, George Creel, the creator of the Committee on Public Information, and American propaganda more generally, forced this idea of what was known in 1917 as 100% Americanism on minority communities. What I think we have to appreciate is that this process is happening both top down and bottom up. These are Jews themselves, people like Israel Beton and others that I'll show you in just a bit, who believe that the war is a chance to demonstrate that there is no conflict between Jewish identity and American identity, that the war can be used to show the loyalty, the good citizenship, and of course, the assimilation of the Jewish community into the wider American context. And this is true, I argue in my book, both about the Irish American community, at least the non-Prussian Catholic German community, and for African Americans as well. The war is an opportunity to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that these communities are loyal to the United States and to the United States first and foremost. So what you see are people like first-generation Jews like this man, Abraham Koroshinsky, who were born in Russia, who understood before they came to the United States, at least this is the way they understand it, who understood military service as something that was oppressive, that's something that came from the top down, that came from the Tsar and forced people into military service. In the United States, however, this man can voluntarily enlist in a New York division, the 77th, whose motto, whose symbol is the Statue of Liberty, and they can serve for a cause that is shared by the soldiers themselves. And you can see the way that he's justifying his enlistment in the United States Army in 1917. He would never have done this in Russia, but here in the United States, it's a government that he can serve with honor and with dignity. And this one I found particularly striking when I found it. This is a soldier who's killed in the Meuse-Argonne at the end of the war in 1918. And the two phrases that jumped out at me here, they are thorough soldiers, and we will have no reason to be ashamed of them. And again, that last part there, that after the war, the epithet coward cannot be hurled at us. Just as Stéphane argued that this military service, this blood tax, this impôt de sang, as the French say, that this payment that the Jewish community will make in the service of the country should end any allegation, should end any discrimination, should end any attacks on the Jewish community as being not part of the United States and not part of the political entity more generally. We all know where this goes, that this, of course, does not end anti-Semitism. In fact, anti-Semitism in the 1920s and 1930s will probably intensify in the United States if it does anything. But you can see the ways in which these men are understanding their military service, as Marc Bloch did, to be something that's going to cement, it's going to solidify the ways in which their Jewish identity and their American identity will come together. This is another one that I'm not able to move the slide forward. Can someone do that? Or do I do it here? Oh, sorry, there we go. This is another one found in the American Jewish Archive in Cincinnati. I can't read the Hebrew script, but the translation that accompanied the letter, I hope it's accurate, said, "Let us eat our matzahs in the same spirit that our ancestors ate them for the cause of liberty and democracy." In other words, what they're doing is following in a Jewish tradition, as well as proving to their fellow Americans and proving to themselves the way that you could update this with a Jewish and an American way of seeing it. And as you can see here from the stationery, and I'll talk about this in just a bit, he's actually doing this through a Young Men's Christian Association stationery here, through one of their hospitality huts overseas. So this one I like a lot, both because it's written in Hebrew, although it has the American flag at the top. The symbolism, the language, the syntax, all of it is intended as a blend between Jewish identity and American identity, even to the extent that it's using a Christian organization to write and to mail this. So if anybody can read the Hebrew script, please tell me if the translation is not accurate. As Stéphane also noted, in the French army, many American Jewish leaders end up taking senior responsibilities in this war. This is the 103rd Infantry Division of Infantry Regiment, excuse me, of the 33rd Division, a New York National Guard unit, with a Jewish commander of that unit. So again, a notion of symbolism, of leadership, of taking advantage of an opportunity. So I talked about the YMCA a little bit. There is a Jewish equivalent, the Jewish Welfare Board of the United States Army and Navy. I don't have much context for this picture, but I really, really like it. This is somewhere in France. This is a member of the JWB opening up a hospitality tent where Jewish soldiers could come and get kosher food. They could find scripture if they wanted to read it. They could pray, they could daven, they could write letters home, whatever it is that they wanted to do. And you can see from the board there on the right-hand side, some of the things that they offered: entertainment, home hospitality, patriotic celebrations, which I love, right? That again, the notion that we're going to use this Jewish group, the Jewish Welfare Board, but we're going to use it for patriotic celebrations. And you see the two flags at the top are American flags. Legal advice, I'm not really sure what that would have been about, unless you're trying to write a will in case of your death. And I was talking to a colleague of mine about what the word risk might mean on there. My colleague is convinced that this is a reference to venereal disease, that you could come in here and get advice on how not to get venereal disease while near the front. So what the JWB is, of course, is a connection of Jewish civilians back in the United States connecting to the soldiers at the front line. This is also the point when the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee is founded, a connection of Jewish charitable groups in the United States and Europe, and connecting both to the war effort of these soldiers and connecting to the recovery and reconstruction of Jewish communities at the end of the war. Here's another example of the way these things are blending. This is, I love the language here as well. The text reads, a Hanukkah Thanksgiving dinner, a perfect, again, blend of American and Jewish terminology, whatever one wants to call it. And in this particular case, there is a large flag with the Star of David. Of course, we all recognize this flag. I was a little surprised to see it in a 1918 usage. Also flying are the flags of the major allied countries in the background, and the unit flag up there as well. So again, there's this combination of symbols, this combination of images that are both Jewish and American. 4 American Jewish soldiers won the Medal of Honor, one of which was given by President Obama posthumously about 10 years ago. Again, a mark, a symbol, a demonstration of the courage on the battlefield of American Jewish soldiers. The very famous Wild Bill Donovan, William Donovan, who created the organization that became the CIA, was offered a Medal of Honor in World War I. He famously turned that medal down unless the United States Army would give one to the Jewish sergeant that was in his unit, who he thought had been denied a Medal of Honor because of anti-Semitism. So a notion even among American non-Jews, American Gentiles, that Jewish military service had been demonstrable and had been important. And of course, the other as Stéphane noted as well, the impôt de sang, the blood tax that is paid for by the supreme sacrifice paid by American soldiers, to indicate again that Jews participated, Jews suffered, Jews answered the call, and Jews paid the ultimate price. So in conclusion, what I want to do is just wrap up real quick, and I want to show you this man who I'd been a First World War historian for a long time before we accidentally came across this photograph. This is a great uncle of mine, born in Romania, who joined the United States Marine Corps in June of 1917 as a path to American citizenship. So he's almost a living symbol of this process at work, coming from Romania, joining the Marine Corps, and using that to become an American citizen while never abandoning his Jewish identity as well. I work here for the United States Army, but my Marine Corps colleagues love when they see this picture in my office. So again, I want to focus on three themes to wrap up with, and then open it up to your thoughts and questions. The importance of understanding the way that identity here is functioning on two levels, just as Stéphane identified. Marc Bloch and others identifying themselves as Jewish and French and not seeing any conflict in those two identities. In fact, seeing those two identities as overlapping, as I note here at the bottom. And again, I think it's critically important to put these events into a context, to understand the events that were going on around them, and to understand the ways in which this is coming at a particular moment in history when this assimilation process, especially for American Jews, is underway. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Galit, תפתחי את המיקרופון.
Thank you very much, Michael. It was very, very interesting. I think we learned a lot from your both conferences. And as you said, I think that we can find many things in common, like the sacrifice, the question of identity. And I would like first, so thank you very much. And I think we have time, until what time, Sarah, we have for the questions?
We've allotted quite a bit. We have a good half hour if we go that long. If we don't, then we're welcome to move it forward.
Okay, so you are welcome to ask your question, to open the discussion.
Those who feel more comfortable are welcome to send questions through the chat. We've also allowed for opening up microphones now. Go ahead, Roni. Just unmute yourself.
This is a question to Michael. I was a bit surprised for what you said about the change in the attitude of Jews in America towards the Germans because of their behavior in the occupied territories towards the Jews, because it contradicts what I read from memories of Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, in which they always said that their parents told them that the behavior of the German army was quite good. I'm talking now about the Holocaust and the World War II. That the German behavior as a soldier was quite good, and they don't need to be afraid from the Germans. And so this for me, it's a kind of a contradiction.
Yeah, of course, it's possible that battlefront that I showed you is something like 900 miles north to south. So everybody's experience is not going to be the same. It's also possible that some of what reached the Western press in 1915 and 1916 was filtered through French and British media sources. My guess would be it's a combination of both of those things. Again, there's a rather intense debate here about whether that behavior of the German army previews what happens later. The people who argue no argue that the German army, as you said, behaved relatively professionally. What the difference was after that territory was occupied and conquered in what mostly is today Poland, the German administration that came in then began to aggressively Germanize the territory that they had taken over. New schools, new languages, new health centers, all of that. The debate, Vehas Ludovicius at the University of Tennessee argues that the Germans come out of the First World War arguing, if we do this again, we're going to have to do it very differently. We're going to have to be much more aggressive and much more total in the way that we approach this. Jesse Kaufman has argued, on the other hand, that these two processes need to be seen as separate, that there isn't a connection between the German behavior in Poland in World War I and World War II. So I think that's by way of saying I'm not surprised that there's inconsistency in all of this. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of this is filtered through propaganda offices. But there's no doubt that Jewish Americans in 1916, reading both the English language and Yiddish language press, would have read stories about German atrocities in Poland.
Hello.
Simha, do you have a question?
Yes. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I really liked both of the lectures, and especially the way they were articulated and actually with the view of making a comparison between America and France in the context of World War I. My question to Michael Neiberg would be, considering this blending of identities and the fact that World War I was an opportunity for the Jews to assimilate. In fact, you quoted a very interesting thing. Someone said, after the war, the word coward cannot be thrown at us. I actually read the same things during World War II, and I also read a lot of reactions of disappointment after World War II, when they realized that no, the transformation had not been as thorough as they thought. So in other words, what sort of parallels could you make between World War I, World War II, and the melting of identities and the way Americans strove to integrate with all the efforts that we know that chaplains could also, Jewish chaplains could also officiate for other faiths?
Yeah, thank you for that question. My first thought is to think of the comparison to the African-American experience in the United States, which goes through this process in both world wars. In World War I, there is an expectation among the African-American community that military service will help to undermine Jim Crow and segregation, and of course it does not do that. There is an expectation that the Second World War will do that, and of course it does not do that. So part of this is the sad, tragic footnote of both of these, that even military service is not sufficient to overcome anti-Semitism and racism, that the context has to change and that the views have to change. So you're right that there is too much optimism in the belief that mere military service, that death on the battlefield, that winning the Medal of Honor, that doing all of this is going to be sufficient to change attitudes. There's a book called The Jewish Threat, which argues that anti-Semitism in the United States Army significantly went up in the 1930s, significantly rose. And I think one could argue racism against African Americans also rose in the 1930s. So this is part, I think, of the one step up, two steps back process of assimilation that occurs in the United States. And I think Stéphane, I don't want to speak about France with Stéphane sitting here as well, but I think this is true of France as well, where there are moments when assimilation happens more quickly, and there are moments when the country takes steps back. So it is one of those things you read with a tinge of sadness, the expectation that things are going to be a lot better when this is over, because people will recognize how much we've sacrificed and what we've done. And then the realization that that's not going to happen. So I'm not sure if I exactly answered your question. I hope that I did. If I didn't, please come back.
Thank you.
Mr. Friedman?
Hi, Michael.
Hi, Hal. I was wondering when I saw the name if that was you. So good to see you, Hal.
Good to see you too. Did American Jews note at all when they were transforming from Russia to Germany as the primary enemy, German army behavior in Belgium in 1914, 1915, or did they strictly focus on the East?
I would say from what the small bit of evidence I've been able to find, and there's not a lot out there, the emphasis is on the East. The emphasis is on what's happening to those Jewish communities in Poland and Ukraine, what we would now call Poland and Ukraine. The emphasis is much more on the East. To the extent that they're commenting on the West, there's not really very much. I would say the focus really is on the East.
Okay, thanks. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
Michael, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, I would like to ask you if you found any diaries, memories, correspondence, the discourse of the American combatant, not where they are expressed their feelings, they express their war experience, something like that.
Yes, most of what I found was actually at the American Jewish Archive in Cincinnati, which I was a little bit surprised at. I work mostly in military archives, so I thought I would find something in military archives, but I did not find very much. So most of what I found is in Cincinnati and New York City. And I was also struck, I've read a lot of soldier letters over the years. These are particularly open and honest discussions with family members and with friends. They seem to be unusually aware of the process and the context within which they're living. So I think my answer, Galit, would be that there's not as many of these letters as I would like to have found. But what I found is particularly rich and particularly interesting. Mm-hmm. So if I had an opportunity, it would be nice to try to find many more and see if they confirm what I've found so far. But so far, I've only found 2 really sizable collections. Like I said, the Army archives we have here in Carlisle, there's almost no way to know which soldiers are Jewish or how to find Jewish soldiers, other than to just read a lot of letters and hope that somebody mentions it, which is not an efficient research methodology. So if I had a chance to go back to Cincinnati, I'd love to dig around those archives a little bit more, but that's where the best letters that I found are located.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful archive they have there. If anybody's coming to do research on Jewish history in the United States, the American Jewish Archive in Cincinnati is fantastic.
I can support it.
Yeah.
Excuse me,
Great archive.
Can I ask? I would like to know if do you have in Carlisle, do you have archives on World War II? And I mean, knowing the fact that it's very difficult to find who is a Jew.
Religion. So finding individual soldiers' memories by religion is very, very difficult. What we do have are the impressions of soldiers as they liberated concentration camps. We have senior officers, sometimes in the 1930s, talking about how they didn't want too many Jewish soldiers, or the Jewish soldiers were distorting what the army was trying to do. And so we have some strong evidence of anti-Semitism in the senior ranks of the US Army. But what we don't have, I'm sorry, let me phrase it a different way. What we do have are soldiers' letters, diaries, recollections, and post-war surveys organized by division. So in World War I, that's easier because we know 2 divisions that were New York National Guard have a disproportionate number of Jewish soldiers in them. So if you want to find Jewish soldiers, you're better off going to the New York division than, say, the Tennessee division. Other than that, there's no way really to know.
But by divisions, didn't you mean infantry?
Yeah, so in World War I, the United States division, so a division in American terms is about 20,000 or 22,000 men. Any division number higher than, I think, 20 is a locally raised division by state. So the 28th division would be all men from Pennsylvania. So New York raised 2 of those. So if you're looking for Jewish soldiers, probably the easiest thing to do is to go to the records of those 2 divisions, because they're from New York State, which is disproportionately where Jews were living.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
I have another question on the chat from Gustavo Guzman, who is not able to use his microphone at the moment. He wishes to ask you also, Professor Neiberg, whether you had the chance to explore the participation of Jewish officials in the armed forces of other countries in the Americas. He is asking that because he is researching the presence of Jews in the Army and Navy of Chile from 1914 to 1973. And regardless of the strong right-wing identities of Chile's army and navy, there were Jewish officials in both bodies.
Wow. So the simple answer is no, I haven't done that yet, but I would love to see what you found, because that sounds like a fantastic and very, very interesting research topic. So the simple answer is no. The longer answer is I'd love to talk to you about it. So Gustavo, please get in touch with me if you can, and let's continue the conversation, because that sounds great.
Thank you.
May I ask a question to Stéphane? Is that okay?
I can answer,
Stéphane,
Michael, yeah.
Stéphane, I'm curious.
To be able to answer.
No, I'm curious what you think Marc Bloch's First World War experience, how that conditioned the way that he understood 1940 and understood France's defeat. I know in Strange Defeat, he talks a little bit about this, but not much of that book is about the First World War. It's about the Third Republic and the problems of France in the late 30s and 1940. Do you get a sense that he has a particular understanding of the causes of victory in World War I and how that helps explain defeat in World War II?
Well, in my eyes, L'étrange défaite, The Strange Defeat, is not only a book on the Third Republic and on Second World War, but a book with very interesting insights by anthropological insights about the different ways of fighting, the differences in fightings between First World War and Second World War. And I think that the footnotes of L'étrange défaite had not been published in the book, but I have the footnotes, and there are many because I knew Marc Bloch's son, Etienne Bloch, very well. And these footnotes are extremely interesting, especially because Bloch refers constantly to Joffre, especially, and compares and try to compare the way the management, the way the High Command managed during the First World War and during the Second World War. And to him, the advantage, of course, there is a sort of lack of lucidity, of willing to fight in the French High Command during the Second World War, and he constantly compare between his own experience of First World War and a second experience during the Second World War. And I think it would be interesting to keep in mind that L'étrange défaite is mainly a comparison. Mainly a comparison. I think we have a much more interesting understanding of this book if we keep in mind it's a comparison rather than an analysis of the regime, of the Third Republic regime, and of the French defeat in 1940. I think it's mainly a comparison, but it's mainly historians of the Second World War who were interested by L'étrange défaite. So I think it's interesting for historians of the First World War like you and me to reread in a way this book in their own perspective.
I just picked up my copy and realized that there are no footnotes. So will these footnotes, are they published in a French edition?
I don't. No. They are not published in French edition. I think they have been published after a conference, but I can't remember where. I think I still have these footnotes, Michael, and I will give them to you.
Thank you.
I will give them to you.
I like your distinction between.
It's an interesting material, I'll tell you.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting your distinction between Bloch as an historian and Bloch as an anthropologist, which is.
I think very. L'étrange des faits is more an anthropologist than an historian in a way.
Now I'm going to have to reread it with that in mind. Thank you.
Michael, I have a question. You can hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
I want to know if there are commemorations, like in France, within the Jewish community, when they commemorate the First World War. There are ceremonies, there are real events. In the United States, it's the same. There is the memory of the First World War American soldiers is present.
So in the United States, unlike Europe, the First World War is a kind of an empty space. I was just talking last night on a Zoom with American high school teachers about the difficulty of teaching the First World War in the United States, because there's really there is no cultural space in the United States for the First World War the way there is in Europe. To the extent, however, that it exists, it is understood, as I think the Second World War largely is too, as a unifying national experience. So there's very little commemoration by community and much more commemoration by nation. This starts to change, I think, with the Vietnam War, where, say, the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., quite explicitly, there's an African-American soldier in there and a Puerto Rican soldier in there. By contrast, all of the faces in most of the First World War imagery are kind of white, generic American faces. There is no distinct understanding. So I think you're running into two problems. One is the core understanding of America until the 60s and 70s as being white, and the general, the French say it better than we do, the grand oubli, the forgetfulness of the First World War in American history more generally. So I'm not aware, other than maybe a marker in a synagogue that might indicate people from that synagogue who died in the war, I'm not aware of any commemoration that is explicitly Jewish. Nor am I aware of any that's specifically any other group, unless it's in a building of religion, unless it's in a sacred space.
And Stéphane, yesterday I looked at I read some pages from your book Combattre, and you are talking quite a lot about those three scholars, Jewish intellectuals, but you never mentioned something about their origin, about their Jewishness. It didn't, at that time, it didn't interested you, it didn't contribute something to your research, because it's linked, the experience of the Jewish soldier.
It's probably a mistake for my part, and that I forgot in a way the Jewishness. The point is that for Bloch and Mauss, they forgot their own Jewishness as well. And I spoke about that with Haddad Becker recently in Italy, and she's still stunned by this way to deny their own Jewishness. it's a completely it's completely different with Robert Hertz, as you know, but with Bloch and with Bloch and Mauss, their Jewishness even doesn't exist during the Great War. So it seems to me that if we try to interpret their writings about their war experience in the 20s and 30s, perhaps it would be a mistake to look at that, to look at this material through their Jewishness. It's our eyes, not their eyes. And I'm in favor of respecting their own way to look at themselves during the war. I think it's a better way to respect, in fact, their way to be French during the conflict. Okay, but I can admit it's a wrong way. But you have to demonstrate me that it is a wrong way.
Thank you.
So, Professor, just want to mention something about what went on in Atlanta, Georgia, in regard to the war, First World War. My grandfather, Rabbi Tobias Geffen, he, in a number of his sermons, which were influenced also by the lynching of Leo Frank, he talks about when Russia is defeated. But I have yet to find, clearly we don't have gone through, he has hundreds of sermons, we haven't yet found him talking about Germany. In World War II, when almost before when Hitler comes to power, he talks about that, interestingly enough, in Yiddish on the regular radio station called WSB, Welcome to Southern Broadcast. But in Atlanta, there was, at least in my grandfather's congregation, an awareness that Russia was out. I don't know about Germany coming in.
Thank you. That would track with some of the research that I did. So thanks for that.
So thank you very much to both our guests, Stéphane and Michael. Thank you for your presentation. And in fact, we see many things in common, mainly with the patriotism, the sacrifice. I think that we can find, maybe we can talk about it at the end of our meeting. We can find many things in common between different Jewish from different countries. The sacrifice, the patriotism, the question of identity, to prove that we worth being citizens of France or American citizen. So we see that we have things in common to all the Jewish combatants, and especially, I think, especially for the First World War. And it will be after that, it will be very interesting to compare between the first and the second war, exactly about those elements. So again, thank you very much, Stéphane Audoin-Rouzeau and Michael Neiberg, and we will see you all in 10 minutes. 10 minutes?
Yes. We will take 10 minutes just to check the microphones of the speakers in the next session, and we will meet again at 4:50 Israel time in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.